I'm going to take exception. Bethy is going to introduce everyone else, but I want to tell a story about the next person. His name is Anton from the Department of Energy, and he is from and represents the Office of Naval Petroleum and Oil Shale Reserves in the United States. And this office is the oldest energy security office in the United States, which was established in 1912 by President Taft, when American geologists looked ahead and when American military analysts saw what Winston Churchill had just announced. Winston Churchill that very same year converted the British fleet from coal bunkers to oil and led the British Empire to the Persian Gulf and to Iran. The U.S. said we must follow Britain and develop this office to look at shale and other kinds of unconventional fuels. The key to this is that this office is and controls a forecast and a study that generates frontier resources, ultimate resources within the United States, where they are, how to commercialize them, strategic planning. The story I wanted to tell about Anton Dammer is about Senator Domenici and Senator Hatch. In the Energy Policy Act of 2005, it was Senator Domenici with Hatch who made certain that an appropriation of funds would go and would earmark and target this ancient office to produce a task force and a 3-volume study, which you're going to get briefed on in a few minutes. Without Senator Domenici, this monumental encyclopedia of oil, shale, sand, heavy oil, ERO oil, and so on would not exist anywhere. It's a benchmark study. It will last longer than any of the energy debates in Congress. When all this is forgotten, there will be people picking up this study on the internet and in libraries. I introduce to you Anton Dammer from DOE.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. That was a very, very nice introduction, and thank you to the Center for allowing me to come and shoot my mouth off. I like to start all my talks out by saying I'm an unashamed and unabashed advocate of unconventional fuels in the United States. I see that as a path away from dependence on foreign oil. I see it as a tremendous opportunity, and I hope during the course of my presentation, which I think is going to become seriously short here, I'll be able to convey that to you. Okay. Trying to learn how to operate this. I might need a techie up here. Is there I got the intro slide. At any rate, let me digress a little bit while we get this thing straightened out. My personal feeling is that we wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't be standing here. Okay, yeah, we could just. You want me to, this is forward? This is forward, yes. Ah, all right, okay. We wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for very few people in our U.S. Senate. And of course, one of them is Senator Domenici. And a number of years ago, well, just about 2 years ago today, he held public hearings in the West on oil shale. And he knew full well that oil shale is the centerpiece to our national fuels security issues. So he really is the father of that. And what you see here is is from the Sentinel. It's Senator Salazar, who now is a little bit less supportive of oil shale than Senator Domenici is, but I think he said it all when he says, "I believe strongly that oil shale development will help our efforts to strengthen the nation's energy security." And that's what my office is all about, energy security. Senator Domenici is very interested in oil shale, and our Unconventional Fuels Task Force, as Dan mentioned, covers CTL from coal, it covers oil sands, it covers oil shale, it covers extra heavy oil, and it covers CO2 EOR, because as you well know, in the development of these hydrocarbons, we're going to have to figure out a place to control and store and use our CO2 to beneficial use. But I'm going to sort of limit my talk today on oil shale, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about background in the commercial sector and environmental issues, our government program, and some development scenarios. Because in order to understand this market basket, you really do have to understand the resource, the economics, what's going on in the government, and whatnot. I'd like to also sort of paraphrase something that Dan said. When Senator Domenici got the Energy Policy Act of 2005, I don't think a lot of people realize we didn't have an energy policy before then. I mean, we were adrift in this energy policy world. And in spite of what people think about the 2005 Act, it really sort of was a benchmark act. It was the first time that we wrote down in something like 17,000 gracefully written pages what we wanted to do with our nation's energy. Dan has already covered this a little bit, but in order to understand synthetic fuels, you have to understand that we've been around a long time. It actually goes back to Scotland in the 1800s, but our office was the first to really get involved in this. They set aside oil shale reserves back in the early part of the century. Even then we knew that this was a very, very valuable commodity. Colony shut down in 1982. Go to any hearing, go to any public discussion of oil shale, and you'll hear what the horrors of the closing of Colony were back in 1982. And my thought about that is you just can't use that as an excuse not to move forward, because a lot has happened since 1982. Unocal shut down in 91, and this Strategic Fuels Initiative started in 2004, and that's pretty much a snapshot of the history of this. Again, a very broken history. What is oil shale? Well, oil shale really isn't oil. It's a very, very junior kerogen compound. It's kind of like oil in elementary school. It hasn't aged a lot. If you left it in the ground under pressure, it would turn into oil in a couple of billion years. So the whole idea of getting oil shale out of the ground is pyrolysis, is to heat it to somewhere around 700 degrees, and it provides a suite of fuels, naphtha, jet fuels, diesel, motor gasoline, pretty much anything you want. So, is there a fuels issue? And I'm going to go over this very quickly. Well, we all hear about peaking of oil. Everybody has their own idea about this. I just read in the paper the other day, I think it was in the Times, that they've announced in Iraq that they may have the largest world reserves at 320 billion barrels. I don't know whether that's true or not. Might explain a little bit about why we're in Iraq. Dependence on Middle East supply. Obviously, we get the majority of the world crude from the Middle East. National energy security, declining world Saudi capacity, the veracity of world reserves. This is one of my favorites. We depend on 256 billion barrels of proved reserves from Saudi Arabia as the largest holder of reserves. If you took those reserve reports to a bank in New York City, they wouldn't loan you a dime on it. 75% of the reserves are in countries that have national oil companies. So there isn't a lot of fungible, privately owned oil out there. Demand growth in China, India, 7–9%. These are exploding economies. Oil industry consolidation. How many major oil companies do we have today? How do they get reserves? They buy each other. The impact on conservation and renewables. I'm a big fan of conservation and renewables. How much oil are they going to put in the tank? How much oil are they going to defer? Ethanol, biofuels. Dan talked a little bit about that. And my favorite is this resource nationalism. At what point do these world economies start to hoard oil? And I think that's the very biggest threat we have. I mean, oil is a fungible commodity as long as it's fungible, as long as it's out in the market. But if you're a country who owns these reserves and is looking out into the future and is making a lot of money on the oil markets, how much of that oil do you really want to put out onto the marketplace? Everybody's seen this chart. This is an EIA chart. It essentially says, and it doesn't change very much, it goes up and down 500,000 barrels a day or 1 million barrels a day, but it says we're going to be consuming 28 million barrels a day in this country in 2030. We consume about 21 million barrels right now. So I think this went down about 1 million barrels in their latest forecast. So this is a little old forecast, but it shows that we are going to be dependent on oil for a good long time. So what's the opportunity? America's endowment of unconventionals is astronomical. We have 5 trillion barrels of coal that could be turned into oil. Oil shale, 2 trillion barrels. A lot of that is located, of course, in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. And where does New Mexico come into this? Well, they're part of this energy corridor. I mean, you take a lot of CO2 down here into the Permian Basin, and a lot more CO2 is going to be made. So we have to learn how to manage that CO2, get it to the right places, enhance our current production. World oil supplies, world oil shale resources. Very simple. You've got to be very careful with this resource. At 25 gallons per ton, we probably have over 1 trillion barrels in the United States. And for the geologists in the neighborhood, a lot of people say, well, this is a very difficult resource to get at. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these in situ technologies. But this core log right here is an USGS core log. And if I had a pointer, the middle one is about 1,000 feet deep and about 1,000 feet of pay. And as you move horizontally across that diagram, that's oil that's in rock at about 40 gallons per ton. And that's why you have companies like Shell and Chevron, EGL, and some of the other companies, Exxon, are interested in this resource. This is the most concentrated resource on Earth. In an in situ technology, you can produce upwards to 1 million barrels per acre. You cannot do that with conventional oil. So it's the big prize. It's huge, it's secure, 1 trillion barrels recoverable, who knows? It doesn't matter at that scale. It's concentrated, up to 2 million barrels per acre. It's potentially economic. We've looked at Alberta. We think the analogy with Alberta is entirely appropriate. We think that the CapEx cost and the OpEx costs are similarly appropriate. Prior failures of the industry. I like this. You go to a lot of meetings and people say, well, we didn't develop the technology, or, well, we had so many environmental problems, or, oh, well, we really didn't understand the resource. That's nonsense. We understand the technology. We need to refine the technology, but the technology did not stop this industry in 1982. Environmental issues did not stop this industry in 1982. The resource certainly didn't stop this industry in 1982. What brought this industry to a stop in 1982 was when Colony pulled out. And they pulled out because the bottom fell out of the oil markets. And it was no longer economic to move forward for these companies. So national energy security. Again, Dan alluded to this. What do we have in terms of national energy security? Well, we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I'm part of that organization. We have now over 700 million barrels of oil in the ground. What does that mean to us in terms of long-term energy security? Well, let's say they blew up the Straits of Hormuz. Or let's say we even had an embargo again. How long would that 700 million barrels stay in the ground? I mean, we can only pump it out at about 4 million barrels a day. So, I mean, how long would that forestall that? And I kind of refer to that as term insurance. You know, we all have life insurance, we have term, we have whole life. But that resource out in the West, that to me is whole life insurance. And if you take a look at some of these metrics that we like to bandy around at the bottom of the slide, we have about 300 million Americans today. And everybody says, oh, our population is level. But in the 2030 time frame, we're going to have 360 million Americans, all wanting energy. Domestic production, it's about 5 million barrels a day now. Okay? What is our projection? Well, EIA says it's going to be 5 million barrels in 2030. Maybe. I think you folks in the Permian are going to be the ones that are going to tell us whether we're going to be able to sustain that. And you know what? I kind of think we will. I think that we will get a lot more out of our existing wells. But it isn't going to raise that curve. It isn't going to produce a lot of oil. It ain't going to put a lot more oil in the tank. Domestic consumption, again, we got to find 8 million barrels a day. So, value of proved reserves. This is one of my favorite slides. Over on the left, you have Saudi Arabia. They're the kings of reserves, proved reserves. Or at least they say so. They have 267, 269 billion barrels of oil that they can bring onto the market. Look what the next largest is, Canada, 179 billion barrels. Where did the majority of that come from? From the Alberta oil sands. So they were the first ones to book unconventional fuels as booked reserves in the world markets. So what happens if the United States, let's not even talk about production, but let's say we prove up the technology for oil shale in the United States. We know what we have out there. We have 1 trillion barrels. You know? What does that mean to the United States if we are able to book as proved reserves? I made up that number, 400, or Dr. James Bunger made up that number of 400 billion barrels. But what happens when we are the owners of 400 billion barrels of proved reserves? We're all in the oil business here. We know how valuable that is. And I think that should be the target. That's real national energy security at that stage. I'm going to shift a little bit because I want to disabuse people about nothing's happening in oil shale. Well, here's a bunch of pictures of companies that are working actively in oil shale. And we have a report out that goes through 2 pages a company on what these are. This is Shell. A lot of the new technologies are in situ, and I'm going to go through these very fast because we're really running out of time. But Shell has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in R&D. And one thing I'm really very, very proud of in the oil shale business is the R&D, I'm a Fed, almost all of the R&D that's going on in there is being done by the commercial sector. It's not being funded by the Feds. Shell here has money in the National Laboratory System. It's their money. It's not matching money. Chevron, IGE, both have in-situ processes. All of them look pretty good. I mean, all the bugs aren't worked out, but they're working on these things. We all know about horizontal surface retorts. Again, don't think back to 1982. A lot has happened. Technologically, we all know that. I mean, we would never be doing what we do in the Permian Basin if we had the same technology we had in 1982. And it's still perking around. Surface retort, this is the Paraho retort. I've talked to the people who have perfected the Paraho retort. Now, I don't know whether to believe them or not because I haven't seen the stats, but no no CO2, it's captured, okay? A water producer, right? So they've solved a lot of the problems that the opposition says occurs. Gee, my nutty. This is a hair trigger, believe me. You breathe on this thing and Novel technology that we've been looking at is the red leaf technology. This is basically a surface mining. They rubblize the shale, impound it in an impermeable earthen container lined with bentonite, and they heat it in place. So there's a lot of novel technology that's going on out there. And you know, we know a lot about thermodynamics that we didn't know in 1982. This looks like a very, very good technology. Okay, shifting again. A lot of people say, well, you're never going to be able to do this by cost. You're always going to be behind the power line on cost. Okay, we developed a model several years ago, and believe me, I'm an economist. Believe me, I'm an economist. That's a sort of an oxymoron. I'm an economist, so I realize these numbers are not exactly right. Okay, but we do feel that CapEx costs could be in the $40, $55 per stream, $1,000 per stream day barrel. O&M costs could be in the $12 to $20 per barrel range. So let's, so project costs. This is what they did in Canada. They brought down their project costs over time, and that's exactly what we need with some new technology. So here's the economic price of oil shale technology. We looked at 4 different technologies. True in situ, we got these numbers from Shell. What they're looking at is $35 per barrel, pardon me. Surface mining, $43 per barrel. Underground mining, $52 per barrel. Modified in situ, $57 per barrel. Breakdown of those costs for a mined barrel, surface retorting, capital costs, 8. Operating costs, 17. Risk premium, 4. Transfer payment, 6. Taxes, 8. $43 a barrel. Well, you know, you've read in the papers, well, what's the marginal cost of a barrel of oil? Well, really, nobody knows about that. I mean, what is that barrel of oil going to cost you once you used up all the supply of the existing oil? But a lot of people are saying that's probably about $80 right now. And you can look at that $80 and you can say, well, you know, that might be a logical floor for oil. Again, you know, economics is a speculative sport. I love it, but I do admit that it is speculative. Okay, so what's the big 1,000-pound gorilla here? Well, this is a chart from Canada, and everybody knows what's happening in Canada. And the big problem there is CapEx costs. You know, that's the big problem anywhere in industry nowadays. And those CapEx costs are now up to $100,000 per stream day barrel and rising. Okay. A couple of things about environment. I don't see a red sign back there, so I'm going to keep going. We've solved most of the problems with the environment. We know how to control NOx, SOx. We know how to use the hydrocarbon gas in the oil shale retort. The big problem is the CO2, and that's a huge problem. But you know, in my mind, our industry is going to have to solve that problem. I don't think climate change is going to go away. I think we're going to have to put the very best minds and the very best technologists together, and we're going to have to figure out how to control carbon, CO2. A lot of it may come down here into the Permian Basin. A lot of it may go into deep saline aquifers or in ocean sequestration. But I don't think it's something that, on the matter of myth and assumption, should stop a commercial venture from going forward. Same thing with land use. I spent a lot of time in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming, and what I hear is, you're not going to rip up the whole west slope of the Rockies. We're just never going to allow that to happen. Or, one of the newspapers, after I gave a talk one day, said, Dammer is advocating turning the west slope of Colorado into something akin of Gary, Indiana. I don't know how they came up with that, but it's that kind of hyperbola that really distorts the picture of commercial development. But in actuality, if we develop 2.5 million barrels, and we've done quite a bit of work on that in Colorado, we would disturb something in the area of 50 square miles. And that red dot right there on that screen is about 50 square miles in that area. And that would be scattered between 20-something different projects. So in many, many cases, you need to have a map to find some of those facilities. Now, that's not to say they would be small facilities. That's not to say, you know, this is big development. But we need to put these issues in the proper perspective. Again, water. Salazar, in his comments last time, most of his comments were about water. We all know that water is a scarce commodity. Well, the simple answer to that is, if an industry wants to go out and do a project, they can't do it if they can't find the water. We all know what water rights are all about here in the West. I was in water court for 8 years trying to perfect the government water rights for the Naval Oil Shale Reserve. So I know full well what a touchy subject this is. But a lot of the technologies that are coming around today are actually net water producers. And a lot of people are starting to take a look at all the water that's being produced by natural gas development and saying, well, at some economic level, cleaning water becomes a factor. And when you look at oil going for, what, 135 plus per barrel, the economics of developing these unconventionals all of a sudden start to change a little bit. You know, all of a sudden that old adage that says, yeah, it'll always be $5 more. It no longer plays, not in this economics, or I hope it doesn't. Our legislative response, this is what Senator Domenici did. He put together a task force to develop a program to coordinate and accelerate the development of these resources. And I'm going to go very quickly through that, if I can get it going. And this unconventional task force contained 3 secretaries, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Interior, and 5 states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Mississippi, and Kentucky. And we developed a program, and we made recommendations, and we published reports. I think Dan has already talked about those. And all those reports are on the web. And the major finding was the nation is substantially at risk from an economic and security perspective to warrant development of an unconventional fuels program with attendant policies and government actions to promote and accelerate industry development. That's a very, very important statement. It doesn't mean we're going to do it. It doesn't mean anybody's going to rush out onto the West Slope and start digging oil shale mines and drilling wells for in situ. But it does mean that Congress at that time, in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, wanted the federal government in league with affected states to sit down with the problem and define a path forward. If you can't define a path forward, you can't go forward. And a lot of the opposition that we see today is you can't do this without ever having a path forward to look at. You know, there's an opportunity, there's a possibility with any of this stuff that you just simply won't do it. Maybe you'll find enough stranded oil. Maybe Iraq really will have 320 billion barrels of proved reserves, you know. But all of this takes time. And to dismiss this resource, to dismiss these massive resources without the adequate technical and scientific background that you need to make reasoned decisions is a huge mistake in my mind. These are some of the strategies, and I'm going to wrap up very quickly. But I wanted to go, we have an economic model. It's on our website. I'd enjoin you to take a look at it and give us your opinion of it. But this is essentially what we're talking about here. If you take a look at all of these unconventionals, those 3 wedges down there, base case, measured case, accelerated case, and I won't go into those because they're cumulative, but if you add all that together, that adds to 7 million barrels a day. And what that tells you is you need to go out and you need to look at all the resources you can possibly muster to get us out of this national energy security problem. Because if you take a look at that top curve, that blue curve that says efficiency, that is a very, very generous curve on what the Department of Energy says we're going to get out of efficiency. Electric cars, you know, renewables. You're just not going to get there. The remaining gray area on the curve is what our future imports would be if we brought on 7 million barrels. This efficiency curve also includes reduction in demand using Department of Energy numbers. So this is the way we should be looking at our energy situation in the United States. I mean, this policy, how do you move those curves? And how do you get to a point where you can model and you can react to that eventuality which ends out there at about 2035? This is just a blow-up of that 7 million barrels. I'm not going to go over this, but we all know, I mean, there's a lot of local politicians here, and there's a lot of people that have worked in state and local government. I myself have also. But there are tremendous benefits in employment and tax revenues and whatnot. So I think the benefits are huge, but we don't want to risk our quality of life to get more money in our coffers. And I believe that both of those, I believe we can create wealth and we can maintain our quality of life at the same time. So in summary, it's a huge resource. It's the most concentrated on Earth. We have a unique opportunity today to look at these resources and to start planning for the future. Because one of the things that I've noticed, I've been in the government for 28 years, and mainly as an operator of oil fields, believe it or not, and I'm amazed at the lack of long-range planning going on. I never had to worry about it before because we used to run Elk Hills and Teapot Dome, and we were a production company. And I just sort of stumbled on this because it was assigned to me by Senator Domenici in the 2005 Energy Policy Act. So where do we go? We need to form a coalition. We need to take a look at these resources from the perspective of the state, the industry, and the federal government. We need to put mechanisms together that people will understand. We need to put together a development plan that all the parties that are involved can sit down and make sure that their sacred cow isn't gored, that they come out of this whole, and they come out of it wealthy. And these are just the reports that we've done. I always put this on there in hopes of folks going onto our websites and reading these reports. The one that Dan was talking about is this integrated report. It's hundreds of pages, but it's divided into 3 reports, and the one I like the best is Volume 2, because it really provides cross-cutting plans to go after some of these issues that seem to plague us, like how are we going to develop the water resources? How are we going to take care of the CO2 into the future? So there are expansive reports, and I would ask all of you to take a look at them or have your staffs look at them, and these are the websites. And I thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and thank you. Thank you, Dan.